Okay, hello and good evening, everybody. My name is Michael Schlossmacher. I am privileged to welcome everybody here at Algonquin College. Welcome to the Brain Health Awareness Week. I'm terribly sorry that I was late and that we actually also waited a few extra minutes to make sure that we can accommodate everybody with registration. So welcome to Algonquin College. Welcome to the University of Ottawa Brain Health Awareness Week. And I just wanted to briefly say a few things. For those of you who have not yet attended an event like this is our 5th Brain Health Awareness Week. And it's really special to have Uta and SaBRE here because it was the two of them who 7-8 years ago in discussions with various members of the University of Ottawa Brain and Mind Research Institute said you have to put on a show to communicate what you do to the public. You have to connect better with the community, and Uta and Sam right. And out of that idea and their tremendous support came this event that we put on now for the 5th time. Multiple events during the course of a week, usually at that time, and we're doing it for the first time here at Algonquin College, which is another step to connect different pieces of the puzzle here in the city. So we're really excited to be here. Thank you for taking time. Thank you for registering and coming. We have a wonderful program today that is dedicated to the repair of the central nervous system, new therapeutic approaches to both brain and spinal cord injury, bridging the divide between the clinical needs and the basic laboratory efforts here in Ottawa. I am the interim director for the University of Ottawa Brain and Mind Research Institute. Our previous director is Dr. David Park. He left for greener or wider pastures because it's snowing in Calgary. He left for Calgary, and he sends his best regards. And it's a wonderful privilege to follow up in the footsteps of very successful previous events. So I'm really excited about today. I'm going to learn a lot from these people that are seated here on the podium. We're going to have a broad range of expertise here that will update us on what's new. And we have a wonderful moderator, Dr. Ndui, from the University of Ottawa Faculty of Science, who will take over and be a moderator for the evening.
So thank you very much, Dr. Schlossmacher, for those kind words to kick off this event. So it's a great pleasure that we see some faces here to listen to some of our brightest researchers. Though I think to be honest, we all know that the students are the ones that are bright, and we are just here to take credit for their work. But we have some really great researchers in the field of spinal cord and brain repair. And what we're going to talk to you about is educate and inform you about some of the basic science as well as some of the clinical advances that have been made here in Ottawa. Because some of you may not be aware, but there's a really nice and growing group of researchers that are tackling the problems around repairing the spinal cord and the brain after injury. It's a formidable challenge, but I can certainly assure you that there's a lot of bright people working on this. And so for today, we will start off with Dr. Yi Tsai, who actually, I have the clicker. So Dr. Yi Tsai, who's the Suruchi Bhargava Chair of Spinal Cord and Brain Repair and Regeneration Research, and she will be followed by Mike Hillebrand from the Carleton University in the Department of Neuroscience, and afterwards, he will be followed by Dr. Corey Harris from the Department of Biology. He's the assistant professor, and then we have the great pleasure of having Tara Jeji, who is the program director of the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation. So it's a really great lineup, and I'm sure that you have many burning questions as well that you'd like answered. So after each of the talks, we'll have a Q&A for you to ask questions to any of our panelists. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tsai to the podium.
Thank you very much. Is there also any way to prevent jiggling on the screen? I don't want anybody to get seasick. So, I'm a practicing neurosurgeon, and I also do research. And that's a relatively rare entity in that there's a lot of clinicians or people who take care of patients and a lot of people who do research, but there's not as many people who do research and do clinicians. So I have a little bit of a different perspective on things, and I thought I'd share that with you. But with everything that I do, it all comes down to the patient. And so this is a 34-year-old man here, and if you look, all the bones should be lined up on top of each other, and they aren't. He's had a spinal cord injury, and when we do the MRI, we can see that not only are the bones abnormal, but we've got abnormal spinal cord as well. So there's the gray stripe in the middle, should be all gray, and there's white stuff in it. So as a surgeon, as a person taking care of this patient, there's nothing we can do about the damage to the spinal cord. What we can do is we can operate to try to stabilize the bones and try to hold them in place so it doesn't cause further damage to the spinal cord. But we can actually repair the spinal cord. And this is the patient after we've operated on them, and we can see that although things have lined up a little bit better, the cord's still damaged, there's still a white signal, and there's loss of tissue there. Now that's the spinal cord. That also occurs in the brain. This is a patient who's a young 43-year-old man. He had a stroke. And you can see the gray part on the other side there where you've lost some of the color of the brain. And then you can see after the stroke, he starts to swell. Now, as a person taking care of this patient, the brain, when it swells, will as it gets more and more swelling, can actually kill the person. So what we can do is we can take off the bone of the entire skull, and you can see the brain's herniating out, but that doesn't fix the brain that's herniating out. This is how, after the swelling settles, you can see now the brain's shrunken back in, and he's actually lost brain. And so we can put the skull back together, but again, we can't fix the brain. So the brain and the spinal cord, although we can take care of these patients, we can't actually fix the damage that's there. So that's in contrast to Google. So if you ever Google brain and spinal cord repair, there's about 50,000 news articles saying that we're on the verge of fixing the brain. We're on the verge of fixing them with stem cells, we're on the verge of fixing spinal cord injury, and we're on the verge of fixing spinal cord injury with stem cells. So why isn't there a cure yet? And that's because there's essentially a valley of death. So what is the valley of death? Well, the valley of death is because we've got really good basic science researchers, and we've got really good clinicians, but there isn't really a good translation between the two. Okay? It's like people who speak French and people who speak English, and nobody speaks French and English. You can't get along. So what we've done and what we've been focusing on here at the Ottawa Hospital, and what our leaders have been focusing on, is translation. It's that translating from the really brilliant ideas that we have in basic science to the really brilliant patient care, okay? And so we were focusing on our translational research. Now, one of the basic premises of this is that historically, so why don't we have a therapy yet? Historically, what's been focused on is understanding the mechanisms of disease. And while we understand the mechanisms of disease, the idea is if we can understand that, we can then focus on reversal of these, test them in animal models, and then we'll have a cure for humans, okay? But the reality is that there is a failure rate, okay? So for example, in cancer, even though we've done really good basic science studies and we've done really good preclinical studies, when they actually then go translate that into patients and do clinical trials on patients, there's an 87% failure rate. That's even higher when we look at stroke. It's a 90% failure rate. And when we look at traumatic brain injury, of the 33 clinical trials that have been done since about 1980, there's been a 100% failure rate. So why is there this failure rate? How can we better improve things? Like I said, the idea was that we understand the mechanisms, we find out a potential reversal, we test them in animals, and we go to humans. Well, one of the things that we've been focusing on is to try to improve this translation to humans so that we can decrease this failure rate in clinical trials. So if you look at that, there's at the far end there's all these really great understanding of the mechanisms, and then we have preclinical research, and then we're focusing on the translational research. Okay? Then we can get clinical trials, and then we can have patient benefit. So one of the things that we've, as a group, have been, and one of the things I've been really impressed with, is that there's a real focus for the basic science researchers and the clinicians to interact with each other. So I've been at a lot of institutions, and it's almost like being in a different country where, you know, the clinicians are like, well, I don't have time for basic science. Or the basic science researchers are like, well, I'm not interested in patients, I'm focused on my worm model, or my mouse model, or my cell model, and I'm not interested in trying to advance that. And what's been remarkable in Ottawa is that, you know, I've gone to different researchers, or researchers have come to me, and we've been able to actually develop some really interesting ideas. It's amazing. So, for example, I'll have some of my clinicians say, well, this is a big problem, you know, we have this as a big problem, and they don't realize that the basic scientists have already developed something that could potentially be used to treat that problem. Or we'll have the opposite, where the basic scientists are like, oh, well, we do that all the time. I'm like, yeah, but if you use that, you can use that to help people, okay? And so we've put together last year was our first symposium, but we've put together a symposium again this year, and it's going to be held tomorrow, where again we bring together basic scientists and clinicians to try to improve the translation of therapies. And so far out of the last symposium, we've formed networking opportunities, and we've actually formed collaborations and grants to actually focus on trying to improve patient care. So I'm going to take you through some of the researchers we have. So as a pipeline, you need to have a wealth of basic science knowledge. You have to have an understanding of some of the interesting scientific aspects of disease. And so our collaborator, he didn't mention this, but he's an expert in some of the neural networks that are occurring in spinal cord. We've also got Dr. Hildebrandt, who's an expert in pain. Okay, and it's very interesting because, you know, when we talk to him about pain, we're like, he studies it in animals, but he actually developed a model where we can actually confirm whether or not these pain therapies in animals actually occur in humans. And interestingly enough, a lot of the pain research, they do it in animals and they just go straight to humans, and we're like, okay, well, we'll try it. But we've actually developed models to actually screen some of these therapies so that we can have a better success rate as opposed to these high failure rates that we're currently seeing. We have researchers who are looking at the genetics of things. We have researchers looking at stem cells and the basic biomedical models. This symposium today, last year we focused on some of the translational therapies. This year we're focusing on pain. And that's because patients with head injuries and spinal cord injuries and all sorts of other brain and diseases, a lot of their problems, not only from the neurological devastation, but a lot of their problems also centered around pain. And so we have a group of basic science researchers, Michael Hildebrandt and Corey Harris, looking at trying to help these patients with pain. And so Corey's up there as well. He's going to speak a bit about cannabis and cannabinoids and looking at trying to help that. I think that's very timely, especially in our current state of regulation. But we've also got people looking at stem cells, animal models. We've also got people looking at mechanisms of stem cells and looking at recovery of brain cells after stroke. And that's kind of interesting as well. You know, I was talking to one of our basic science researchers, and she's like, well, I found this new thing in brain for regenerating the brain after stroke, and it works in mice, but I don't know if it works in humans. And it just so happened that I had taken brain from a patient who had a huge stroke and wouldn't survive with that brain, and so she had that tissue, then she could test to see if that same mechanism worked in humans. So it's that constant interaction and communication back and forth that will help advance. So we've talked about some of the basic science mechanism models, we've talked about animal models, and then we've also got a group of engineers who are involved. So we've got engineers like Andrew Pelling, Yudong Chow, looking at different biomedical applications of biomaterials to help regenerate the brain and the spinal cord. And again, it's very interesting that you have that communication between these disciplines because if you're only, so for example, when we were studying spinal cord injury, we were looking at growth factors and different types of signaling molecules. And then one of the engineers said, well, what's the elastic modulus or the stiffness of the spinal cord? And we're like, we don't study that because we're biologists. They don't look at that. And interesting enough, when we tested that, we found that actually the stiffness of the biomaterial actually had a huge effect, where if it was too stiff, it didn't regenerate, and if it was not stiff enough, it would collapse and not facilitate regeneration. So that multidisciplinary aspect of trying to have an engineers and other types of physicists involved really helped to advance and help with therapies. And then we've also got a group of clinicians, okay? And these are people who not only are very busy taking care of patients, but they actually spend the time to actually understand the research, and it's supported. So one of the big things that we're doing right now is that, like I said, people test it on cells, people test it on animals, and then they go straight to humans. We've been actually able to get human tissue. Now, I'm not, if I asked anyone of you, who's going to volunteer their brain, to give me their brain to study? Well, no, and usually you want, or who's going to give me your spinal cord? You need those. So that's one big reason why there's been a holdup in terms of advance in care for these patients, because we don't have human cell tissue to look at. So for example, with blood cell diseases, people are willing to give blood so that they can test blood cell diseases. People can often give skin, but no one's going to give their brain or spinal cord while they're alive because they need it. And so we've actually been able to get around that. We've been able to get through a lot of work with my lab, ways of getting human tissue from organ donors so that we can confirm and test some of these therapies before we go straight to humans. And this is unique in Ottawa. At this present time, there's, as far as we're aware of, there was a group in France that tried to get spinal cord to test, and they weren't able. They were able to show some cells, but they weren't able to keep cells going. There was a group in Toronto where they were able to get them growing, but they've since been lost their ability to get these tissue. In Ottawa, not only are we able to get brain and spinal cord, we're able to get other tissues, and we're trying to get other researchers in other fields to improve their translation. So we've now got collaborations with people who are studying muscle diseases. We've got people who are studying skin cells. We have people who are studying even Parkinson's and looking at ways to try to improve translation. And so this is the goal of this institution in our group, is that we're trying to facilitate this translation or this ability to improve our therapies and our research towards human treatments. And I can't end without saying that we've got tremendous community support. So unless, we've got a group of amazing, brilliant, innovative researchers, you've got clinicians who are willing to facilitate this, but we've also got community support. And I've listed two of these people, and one of them is going to be speaking afterwards, Tara Gigi, and we also mentioned the Bargavas, who've been able to help support and encourage this collaboration, this goal journey towards trying to improve care. So it all comes back down to the patient again. So right now we have brain diseases, we have spinal cord problems, and we can't fix them. But hopefully with our pipeline and our group that we've amassed, we can take any bright idea at any point or stage in development and try to bring this toward patients. So right now we're in the building stages. It looks potentially a little bit bleak, but hopefully we'll be able to build something that will be beneficial to the community as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eve. So I was remiss in not mentioning before Dr. Sai talked that in addition to being the Sugar Chair in Spinal Cord Brain Regeneration research, he's also a leader, not just national, but international scene in terms of neurotrauma. This is shown by the fact that he's co-chair of the latest international neurotrauma meeting that happened in Toronto. So this is someone who is of great importance to the research in terms of spinal cord care. And this program that you mentioned is the first one in the world that's based in Ottawa has really galvanized. And many of us here standing here are participating with the tissue that she'll be collecting in terms of further understanding how to apply our research in animal cell models towards treatment of humans. So this is really exciting to all of us. So thanks again for that great overview of what needs to be done on the clinical and basic side. So one of her collaborators is associate professor in the Department of Neuroscience at Carleton. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Michael Brand, whose research is founded by Kane Institute of Health Research, amongst others. So certainly he's developing really great research programs.
Thanks, Tuan, and even for all of you for the opportunity to talk about what our lab is doing and how we're part of this network in Ottawa that I think is doing some really exciting things. And so my little piece of that puzzle, my lab's piece of that puzzle, is looking at pain signaling, pain processing at the level of actually pointing might be a little hard, but you can see at the level of the spinal cord. And specifically, we're looking at how molecular changes at the levels of the spinal cord can cause chronic pain, with the ultimate goal to try to identify new potential targets for treating and managing pain. And as Eve has said, there's this large translational divide because of collaborations with Eve. We're slowly trying to get across that huge canyon of getting targets, identifying targets, and getting them into treatments. But before I get to our research, I thought I'd back up a little bit and talk about what is pain. So maybe I'll ask you all, put you to work a little bit. So maybe just one or two words. When you think about pain, what are words that you'd use to describe and to define pain? No. Yeah? Go for it. Yeah.
It's your brain registers
Yeah.
sensation when you are hurting yourself or something within you is hurting, and your brain sends messages to say that it's hurting.
Yeah.
The hurt happens first before the brain gets the message.
That's excellent. So we have brain, we have sensations, we have hurting. Anything else? Trauma. Yeah, in terms of source.
Distracting or constant distraction.
Constant. Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of people are experiencing. Yeah.
There are different kinds of pain. There's
Yep.
intermittent, chronic, and I don't know how many others, but
Okay.
I know that there are different.
There's different types. Yeah. Anything else?
Isn't there pathological?
Yes. Aversive. So it's bad. It's something. Yeah. Yeah.
It prevents you from living your life fully.
Prevents you from living your life fully. Exactly. So those are some great ideas that touch on multiple aspects. And so part of kind of getting to this is the idea that, so what is pain? So it's this unpleasant sensory and emotional, right, that go hand in hand experience in response to potential tissue damage or actual tissue damage. And so this is going to be critical because pain's unpleasant by definition, right? So is all pain bad? Because we often think of pain and we kind of lump it, that pain is something we need to block. Well, pain's a useful thing. As being a father, I have a daughter who really wanted a skateboard. And so we tried to stall, but eventually she was persistent, and so we bought her for her birthday. We bought Megan a skateboard. And so it didn't take her very long to learn that skateboards are pretty unstable, and you can fall and you can hurt yourself, right? And so there's learning that happens, that we learn what's dangerous, and then when we do get injuries, like Megan skinning her knee, she learns to protect that in the meantime when it's hurt, to protect it so that it can heal and so that you can recover. So there's a lot of physiological, useful purposes for that form of pain that we don't want to block as clinicians, at least in certain conditions. We do maybe have surgery, in some ways, yes, but in general, we need that system intact. But then there's another type of pain, and that's chronic pain. So these are general terms. There's more specific conditions too. But so the question then is, how is chronic pain different? Well, chronic pain is a type of pain that will persist after that initial tissue damage or that source of the initial signaling goes away for weeks, maybe months, even years, sometimes a lifetime, right? After that injury has resolved, that chronic pain can persist. And so features of chronic pain, there's different clinical features of it, and I was going to do an examples, but I'll tone it down. But so the one feature is, these are big terms, but allodynia is basically, so something as simple as maybe like wearing a watch, your clothes. So a stimuli that normally, sensory stimuli that wouldn't cause pain, for some people could cause a pain response. So that's allodynia. So a pain response from non-painful stimuli. You can have hyperalgesia, where now painful stimuli is a lot worse, and you can have spontaneous pain, just pain that can be present at any time without a stimuli. And so these are different clinical measures that we can actually study in our model systems too, and look at how can we reverse these. So then, in terms of chronic pain, it's a huge crisis, I think. I think we can all agree to that. 1 in 5 Canadians experience chronic pain or have the symptoms of chronic pain, and that can be caused by various different disease states that might range from cancer to cardiac to diabetes to neurodegenerative diseases to traumatic accidents. So there's many different disease states that can cause chronic pain, but chronic pain itself can become its own disease and can be its own disease as well. So it's not always just a symptom. And so we have this disease that's highly prevalent, that's debilitating, that costs obviously economically billions of dollars, but more importantly, it really impacts lives. And we are missing, we have so few in terms of, and Eve and clinicians could speak to this a lot better than me, but few treatments that can address this problem. And so a lot of them don't work, especially for chronic pains. The ones that do work often have side effects. And then with the opioid crisis, we're seeing also, besides the use in the clinic, there can be potential for abuse beyond those patients, right? So there's a real problem here that as researchers and clinicians that we need to mobilize to try to, and we are mobilizing to try to address. Before I wanted to go on, I wanted to point out here that pain's multimodal. And so yes, there's that biological aspect of pain, but there's also kind of the mental health components, the psychological, there's the social components that can drive persistent pain and other outside factors. And so there's actually interventions that can target those different areas, things like social support, cognitive therapy, physical therapy, education, all of these things can be used. But our piece of the puzzle is looking at the biological components and looking at what goes wrong basically and trying to address that. And so specifically in the pathway, my research team, we're focused at the level of the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is what connects those pain receptors, like in our hands, that would sense maybe thermal tissue damage or a cut or those kind of things, those kind of stimuli. And then those signals would go to the spinal cord, which would then be relayed to the brain, where you have that encoding of this unpleasant emotional and sensory response. And so the spinal cord does relay it, but it does a lot more than that too. So the spinal cord is a processing center. So before the signals even get to the brain, it's combining those inputs from the pain receptors, but also descending signals from the brain that actually can turn up or turn down basically the volume on the pain signaling. And so it can regulate that. And so it's involved in processing that pain. And because of that critical role in processing the pain, you could see how then if you lose control of the signaling, the excitability within that network, you could have chronic pain. And so you can think of the spinal cord being a car going down the 417, and you have one, it's doing what every driver, we've been taught not to do in driver's ed. You have one foot on the gas pedal, 1 foot on the brake, 1 foot on the brake. Well, how can you speed up that car? You could either take your foot off the brake or push down harder on the gas. And so those are mechanisms that could basically cause this increased excitability, increased pain signaling. And so those are the mechanisms that my lab studies at a molecular, at a cellular level. It's trying to figure out and tease apart what's causing this loss of control. And so we use animal models a lot to do those kind of things. And as Eve said, up till recently, when I started my lab, that's kind of where the lab was in terms of identifying targets, looking at their role in this loss of control, and trying to characterize these pathways. But we're slowly moving beyond that and so we have a similar type of picture because traditionally a lot of medicine is based on identifying targets, showing they work in animals, making sure basically that they're safe and they don't affect liver enzymes, and then basically going straight to the clinic. So shooting across the cliff and just hoping that we make it across and there's this big divide, right? And so when things don't work, there's a lot of potential reasons that it couldn't be. But one of the questions could be, well, are these even mechanisms we're identifying? Are they relevant in the human state? And so we're doing that now in partner with the SciLab and with others. So Eve's developed this. Sorry, I can't read my own text. Eve's developed this ability to collect, as she said, tissue from human organ donors. And I should just say we take that really seriously. That's a huge, obviously, a selfless sacrifice of the donors and the families. And so we really try to maximize the amount of questions that we can answer with this precious tissue. And so we have in the tissue, because it's taken from organ donors, the real rarity is that it's not many, many hours after death, that the tissue is still very viable. And so the neurons, the cells are still alive and they're still signaling. And so we can actually do the same type of models of pain in a dish that we've done in animal studies, now in human studies. And so it's a lot of pictures there showing we can ask questions and try to test them with multiple types of techniques. Electrical recordings we can use, we can look at the certain types of receptors across the spinal cord, we can see how proteins change in a dish model of chronic pain and look to test for differences. And actually one of the key drivers of this is, it's not me doing a lot of this research, so I'm gonna embarrass her, is SaBRE. She's a PhD student in the lab. She's over there, turning red right now. And she's been actually one of the first people in the world to actually record from the spinal cord neurons and look at differences. So, and she's been presenting this at conferences, and we're getting really good feedback on this ability to kind of blaze new paths. And so then, that's kind of what we can do. And so basically, I'm going to show a super overwhelming slide, but don't worry, because basically there's a whole pathway. And so up top, that's a whole pathway of certain molecules and all potential targets that we could look at to address pain. And so the shorthand for that pathway is basically you have this loss of brakes. The first part of the pathway is loss of brakes, so the decreased inhibition, but it's directly coupled to the foot on gas. So we have this mechanism that's this vicious loop that's a runaway excitability. And so we've seen that in rodent models, and we are seeing it in the human tissue. So we're showing that, yes, this mechanism is conserved across species. So that's a critical, so we're starting to see proof of concepts. And this is informing how we choose then which of these targets to try to test to see if it'll reverse pain in these models. And I should highlight, this is where the project's going, but it's conserved between species, but actually there's some male-female differences that are critical. That's another huge gap. And actually our human studies were what initially helped shine light on that. So now we have a whole new path that Emery's working on, looking at potential differences, and that could inform treatments that might work better in one sex and not the other. And so I'd just like to thank, obviously, it takes a village in science, just like in life, and so there's many different people here that have been part of this project and funding from a lot of different organizations. I'm missing some of the ones that are here as well, and obviously the organizations like the Ottawa Hospital, uOBMRI, Carleton, that have also supported this work. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michael, for describing this groundbreaking research to us. So our next speaker is Dr. Corey Harris. He's assistant professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Ottawa. He's a phytochemist, so his expertise is studying the different chemicals found in plants and trying to identify whether they have potential therapeutic applications. And he talked to us about, I've never heard of this plant before, cannabis? Is that the plant? This is, as Eve mentioned, very timely. So he's going to talk about the potential role of cannabis in treating the spinal cord.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bui, and thank you all for coming. So, I'm going to be talking to you today about cannabis, particularly in terms of its therapeutic potential for treating pain. So I'm not going to talk too much about my research. I was assuming that perhaps that with all the changing legislation and hearing in the news, we hear a lot about cannabis, but sometimes not everyone understands exactly what's meant being said. So I'm going to provide some background there. Also, to start with, I just want to have some statements to make. The first is thank you all for coming, and also thank you for the organizers, for the invitation. I do not work for the cannabis industry. I have no connections. I'm an independent researcher. I do have a license to conduct cannabis research at the University of Ottawa. I'm also not a medical doctor, so I can't tell you what to take when, at least not ethically. And the last point is that pain is very personal, and no one person's pain is the same as another person's. As we learned from Dr. Hildebrand as well as Dr. Sai, we can have all sorts of different types of pain, and there's different contributing factors, people's life experiences. All of these things contribute to pain, so I'm going to try and not put my own experience of pain onto this presentation. So, Dr. Hildebrand already hosted this number, so 1 in 5. 1 in 5 is the number of people in Canada and around the world roughly or so who experience chronic pain throughout their lifetime. So look around the table. If not now, but chances are at least one of the people that you're sitting with has or may experience, or yourself, of course, chronic pain. Now, also mentioned is, in general, we do not have a great selection of effective and safe analgesics, so pain-relieving medications. There are a lot that are used, but sometimes they come with debilitating side effects or risk of addiction or overdoses, as we've seen with the opioid crisis. This next number, over 50%. Over 50% is the percentage of surveyed medical cannabis users who say that they use cannabis to treat pain, symptoms of pain, or conditions related to pain. And when I say over 50%, there's been about 6 or 7 studies over the last 10 years that have looked at this in Canada, and most of them are up above 70, but the very lowest was 50, and I just wanted to put one thing on the slide. So it's widespread, right? And so at least people perceive that cannabis is effective for managing pain. And this isn't really, it's, as you know, Dr. Bowie has been in the closet that he hasn't heard of cannabis, because cannabis has been hand in hand with human culture for millennia, right? We see it in archaeology, we see it in art, we see it throughout different cultures, is that cannabis has been used, and it was used ceremonially, spiritually, as well as medically. In the late 19th century, in fact, here in North America, cannabis was one of our first lines of treatment for all sorts of different conditions, including things like pain, but also some things that seem a little counterintuitive, like asthma. And then we had, of course, Prohibition, where cannabis was the weed sprouted from hell. And there really ended the research into the therapeutic potential of cannabis ended, and there started to be much less research, but in different directions. Today, we see cannabis all over the place. If we're talking about actually today, it's on every radio station you tune into. But we also see it in terms of hemp seeds and hemp oil that people might be consuming as a natural health product, a dietary supplement. We also have hemp fibers that are used in different technologies, including clothing. But today, I'm going to be focusing on the drug and medicinal use, and this is generally derived from cannabis flowers. Now, you might have heard, or if any of you have looked into this online, there are a tremendous variety of different types of cannabis. And they go by all sorts of ridiculous names, ranging from Girl Scout cookies to sour diesel. And so just to put this in concept, it's a bit the same as having different types of apples and different types of potatoes. They have different names, and some potatoes are better for cooking, some potatoes are better for frying, right? So you can kind of think of these different names of cannabis as representing slightly different varieties. However, they are all still marijuana. They all come from the same species. And in fact, so this is a picture of the female cannabis flower, and if we zoom in on the end here, right, so here we zoom in, and if we zoom in again, on the surface of the flowers, as well as less so on the rest of the plant, we have these structures called trichomes. And these are these are little chemical factories. And they're actually there on the plant to deter insects and herbivory and stuff. However, through selective breeding by humans, we've been able to develop it for other purposes. So in these little factories, there's been tons of different chemicals identified. In terms of the medicinal properties, most people think about the cannabinoids. There's also terpenes, which give the smell and the odor, or the odor, depending which side of it you're on, as well as the taste, and then there's others. So things like dietary antioxidants that you get from fruits and vegetables are also in cannabis flowers. So THC, so tetrahydrocannabinol, and CBD, cannabidiol, are two that you might have heard of. Just to give a little bit more background information, so in the plant, these cannabinoids are actually produced in an inactive form, and they become activated with smoking or otherwise through heating. So if you just consume raw cannabis, you're not going to get the same effect as if it's smoked or if it's cooked or otherwise heated. So THC is the main psychoactive component of cannabis. And in fact, THC was, when THC was discovered, it led to the discovery of an entirely new neurotransmitter system in the brain. And using cannabinoids, that actually defined the endocannabinoid system as mitigating things like pain, throwing up, vomiting, nausea, appetite, and spasticity. And these are all actually based in clinical trials that were done in the 1970s and 80s. Currently, THC is kind of viewed more as the recreational substance in cannabis. It's one that people get high on. Cannabidiol is one that's getting a lot of interest for therapeutic purposes. It's non-psychoactive in the sense that it doesn't really get you high in the same way. However, there are reported effects on pain and anxiety, which are mediated at least partly in the brain, so I wouldn't say they're not psychoactive. And they're also generally can be found in very high levels in the plant. Currently, there's well-documented anti-inflammatory effects, as well as there's lots of clinical trials looking at CBD in terms of epilepsy and Dravet syndrome in children. And so whereas THC is often considered, the recreational, CBD is more commonly now consumed in oils or in other forms that are not smoked. So how do these work? Well, I don't want to get into too much detail, but in general, THC and other cannabinoids, they activate the endocannabinoid system. So they actually mimic compounds that the body already produces to control things like hunger and pain signaling and mood. And so whether it's THC or CBD that might do it in slightly different ways, this is one of the pathways through which cannabis is believed to mediate pain. And in fact, as research goes on, there's more and more molecular mechanisms to suggest that cannabis would be effective in treating pain. So talking about this translational divide, there's a whole lot of research done in animal and cell models. And I've told you about some survey data in humans, but so in animal models, there's actually been thousands of different studies done. They demonstrate that THC, CBD, or cannabis and other extracts might be working in several different ways to reduce pain, particularly in animal models. I just have a little picture here, so these would be simplified things that range from operative pain to simple things like heating up a platform and seeing how long an animal keeps its foot down or keeps its tail in place. In general, cannabinoids show strong pain-relieving activity in animal models. However, in terms of mechanism, we really know very little about humans. And this comes again to this translational divide. And I'm happy to say just a couple days ago, together with Dr. Hildebrand and Dr. Tsai, we submitted an application to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research to try and look into how cannabis affects human spinal cord and pain signaling within the human peripheral nervous system. So this is basically, so experimental data suggests that cannabis should be effective. And obviously, from survey data, people in general find that it's effective. But maybe the people completing the surveys just want to be using cannabis, so they're like, "Oh yeah, everyone uses it for pain, so that's what I'm going to say too," right? But there's been quite a bit of clinical, controlled, randomized clinical trials that have been trying to determine whether cannabis is effective in treating different types of pain. So I'm not going to go through all of the clinical data because we're up to 60-odd studies that are considered good quality with thousands of people in them. And so we're at the stage of meta-analysis, systematic reviews where we try and put all of the data together and draw conclusions about their safety and the efficacy of cannabinoids. So 2015 was a great year for cannabis systematic reviews in pain. There was 3 or 4 that came out that all had very similar results. Now, some of these reviews were for inhaled cannabis. Others grouped together nasal sprays or pharmaceutical type of cannabis extract, as well as smoked cannabis, as well as synthetically made cannabinoids that are unlike THC but work through the same mechanism. And in general, in 2015, everything looked positive. There was a positive, significant effect compared to placebos with a pretty good safety profile. 3 years later, there's been 3 more that have come out in the last couple years, and they generally, so once again, they're looking across different types of pain. So non-cancer pain, this includes stuff like diabetic neuropathy, cancer therapy-induced neuropathy, fibromyalgia, arthritis. So this is a very mixed group of pain, but it was the same thing in 2015. But anyways, I guess my message is really that it wasn't that it was negative, just that it wasn't really very positive, and so it wasn't seen as clinically viable according to these most recent reviews. But one of the authors of these reviews actually highlighted that the problem is that we're dealing with different types of pain, and we're also dealing with different, and in all of these different studies, people were using different cannabis products, right? And so I mentioned that cannabis contains up to 500 different chemicals, right? And so depending what's in a given type of cannabis, perhaps it has different toxic or therapeutic effects, right? So I just come back to this slide because at the end of the day, if you have so many people suffering from chronic pain, failing to receive adequate treatment through available pharmacotherapies, and reporting that cannabis is relieving their pain symptoms, then that's kind of why the system has been developed for medical cannabis, right? So that people do have alternatives. That said, there's a lot of confounding effects. And so I mentioned that one of the things my lab is doing is I'm collaborating with more intelligent people, more neuroscientists who are going to help look at the system in humans. My focus is really looking at how chemistry correlates to therapeutic effects and toxic effects. So I mentioned all of these different strains. Right now, the science is out in terms of pain. Is it just an effect of THC? Is it THC and cannabidiol? Or is it in fact other compounds, other chemicals that are produced by cannabis that together lead to the therapeutic effect? And so within the cannabis literature, this is kind of called the entourage effect. Now, also, cannabis can be consumed in all sorts of forms, right? So there's the flower, it can be produced into oil. There's other sorts of illicit products that are not currently available in Canada, but that you can buy in the US, like hashish or shatter, or different types of concentrates. Soon there'll be drinks and foods. And then these can also be consumed in different ways. So they can be vaporized, they can be smoked, they can be topically applied in a cream. And so what my lab does is we look at how the chemistry changes with these different transformations into different products, as well as the different routes of administration. And then we apply these to cell-based models and animal-based models to really try and determine, well, to answer this top question, what are the major chemicals involved, and to actually see if there are certain types of cannabis products that might be more effective to treat conditions like pain. So with that, I'd like to thank the funders. I also would thank Health Canada for giving me my license. It only took 3.5 years of terribly painful negotiations, as well as the people on the stage who have been great collaborators thus far. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Corey. I think we are all looking forward to seeing how your systematic and rigorous analysis of the different components of cannabis affect the activity of spinal neurons in the human spinal cord. Yes. So we're just getting set up for our next speaker. I'd like to introduce her. Her name is Tara Gigi, and we're very fortunate that she came down from Toronto to speak to us about give a perspective from the consumer and the community about research into spinal cord injury repair. And so Tara is the program director of the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation. We as researchers rely a lot upon different founding agencies to help us support and advance our research, and the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation has been a great supporter of the research in Ontario, but as well as in Ottawa. So once again, we're very happy and fortunate that Tara made the trip down to Ottawa to speak to us tonight. So thank you very much, Tara, for being here. Should we? Yeah, I was going to start with questions. Well, while we're waiting for Tara's slides to come up, if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask. Actually, yes, gentlemen.
What's the risk of being addicted to the medical cannabis? Yeah, I was asking, what's the risk of ending up by being addicted to the medical cannabis?
Well, I would say that we don't have any strong data in terms of risk, in terms of a percentage of people. Certainly, there's higher risk among people who have substance abuse problems to begin with. And there is known both psychological and physiological addiction to cannabinoids. In fact, there is a syndrome, a dependency syndrome that has strong symptoms, and that is now, we're actively, not we as in me, but in the royal we of the scientific community, actively looking towards treatments for treating cannabinoid syndrome. And to be in quite an ironic twist, the leading candidate is cannabis, where, for example, a lot of the time people will develop dependency to THC, and CBDs so if you consume cannabis with low THC, you get a lot of the other, you get some of the sensory satisfaction without necessarily reinforcing the habit. So there's definitely risk, and I should say there's been some amazing work done at McGill University that has shown that the pain-relieving effects of cannabis are at a far lower dose than the recreational use, so where people are consuming much smaller doses and experience pain relief. Now, this was only a small clinical trial, so there's definitely still work to be done.
Are there other questions? I think Oh, no, there's time if you want to ask the question. Yes, absolutely.
This is going to sound like a really strange question, but when you were, it's really for Dr. Tsai, but when you were, or Mr. Hildebrandt, but when you were talking about the tissue donations of brain and spinal cord tissue, I'm assuming that those donations come from somebody in a situation in hospital. They die, and you ask the family, approach the family, or something of that nature. But is there a proactive way that people can direct this to your research when they're healthy? Like, you know, we all sign our organ donor card when we have on the back of our driver's license. But is this something where people can specifically direct these donations? I know that's really weird, and we may not be there yet. But I just wondered if that's a thing of the future that might be happening.
I can speak loud enough. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think just being an organ donor, because you have to meet all these certain criteria in terms of the condition of the state. So basically, if you're an organ donor and the situation is right, then you would be
somebody would direct that to you through that system. Okay, that's what I was curious about.
Sorry, I didn't catch the question.
I was just saying that I assumed that the way the brain and spinal cord tissue was donated to research was through a scenario that evolved, or a particular patient that, you know, became deceased, and you realized that that tissue would be helpful to the research. But I didn't know if there was a proactive method of planning for that donation. But I understand that it would all come through the system of people who signed off on their organs.
So the ethical and intricacies of this is astronomical. In fact, it took about probably about 3 or 4 years for the group in Toronto to just kind of navigate the ethics of it. Because they had kind of paved the road for us, it took us a little less longer, maybe a day or two less. But essentially, what we want to do is we don't collect any of the brains, because by definition, you can't be an organ donor unless you're brain dead. So usually these patients, we don't collect any brain tissue. We haven't. We initially just went for the spinal cord because trying to get brain tissue would involve another incision. And also what we wanted to do was we can't really wait. So when they tried this in France, they tried to get people who were deceased and then get consent and then try to get the tissue. But the act of trying to get through the body to try to get the vertebrae out and then try to get the tissue, it just took too long, and they weren't even able to get any live tissue.
Okay.
So then they worked towards organ donors. And with organ donors, then they were able to get live tissue. And so the ethics of that involves you have to be declared brain dead. And of those who are declared brain dead, even if they wanted to say donate the tissue, for us to actually then harvest the tissue is very difficult, because we'd have to get them to a place like intubated and ventilated, and then get them to a place to harvest the tissue. So there's a lot of the details that, you know, just we wait for them to be organ donors, and then by that virtue, once they harvest the organ tissue, then we go in and we take out their spinal cord. Interestingly enough, our study actually facilitates the organ. So in the past, what happens is the organ retrieval team comes, they get the tissue, then they have to wait, because they have to close up, and then they can then take their transportation back to then place the tissue back into the organ recipient. Because we're there, they don't have to wait to close. So that actually saves them time. They can actually leave right away, and we'll close for them. So we've been looking at ways to try to make it a win-win for everyone.
Right.
And this is a way where we can get tissue, as well as help the organ retrieval team to expedite their ability to then transplant these organs.
So as long as the individual has signed off on that beforehand, that you
So
don't have to go through this
Right.
process of permission.
So
with
if
the
they
family.
have signed an organ donor card, then they are approached by the organ retrieval team. Now, for us to then retrieve their spinal cord, it's a separate consent. Trillium wants it that way. They think that they do not want to cloud the public's view of research, and so the only research they'll support is research specifically for regards to organ donation. In the past, they would support research for other things, but now they only want to support research for organ donation. So we had to then arrange to get a separate consent with a separate group of people. So these families are approached twice, once by Trillium, and then once Trillium agrees that they're an organ donor, they'll notify us, and they actually, and then we can approach the families to see if they are also willing to donate for research purposes.
Thank you. I did ask because my father had signed off, but we still were asked permission, and I always thought that was confusing. Why wouldn't they think they have to ask? But so now I kind of understand. It's much more complicated than I thought.
It is, and we, the reason for that is because we always want to make sure that it's in the best wishes, and not specifically for organ donation, but things like blood transfusions and things like that. People may sign something, but then they change their mind, and we never know. So, that's why they have all these other steps.
Right.
It's like when you go to the airport, they check your ticket, then you have to go through and get checked again, then you get checked before you. They have all these other steps just to make sure that you really have a ticket.
Thank you.
Do we have it working?
Okay, so once again, I'd like to welcome Tara Gigi from the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation. Thank you very much for being part of this day.
Thanks to Dr. Eve Tsai, who invited me to speak today on consumer perspectives on pain, as well as share the work we are doing at Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation. I titled it My Story, which is somewhat a story of many, and I learned a lot from many others who live with spinal cord injury and require assistance and go through some of the same challenges living their daily lives. I would like to tell a little bit about Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation. It's a non-profit organization located in Toronto, funded by Ontario government, which works to prevent neurotrauma and to ensure Ontarians with neurotrauma lead full and productive lives. We have been funded for last 20 years, and our reach is provincial. So I lead for 5 academic health sciences centers from London, Ottawa, Kingston, Hamilton, and Toronto. In all those 5 sites, research in spinal cord injury. We support knowledge sharing and research outcome evidence-based practices in 3 areas: traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, as well as injury preventions. And in the area of spinal cord injury, we are funded for $2 billion roughly for each year. Now we are funded for next 3 years. I titled it Hope. First of all, it's a feeling which, as we define, of expectation or desire for certain things to happen. I'm going to talk about life, about my life, and how hope intersecting during some critical moments and times. Hope plays a pivotal role in our lives, and in many situations, junctions of our lives, it's hopes which keeps us moving. On the other hand, we all have pain as well, which is our topic of discussions today and tomorrow. And we did talk about how do we define pain. It's a perception of feeling of discomfort, and it is very personal to each individual's, and how they perceive it, how they feel it, and how they cope with it. In spinal cord injury, 2 common kinds of pain is chronic pain and neuropathic pain. Neuropathic pain is something described as a stabbing, burning, tingling pain in body below the spinal cord injury level of injury. Perception and interpretation of pain is very personal, as I said. Reflecting on pain in life of individual with spinal cord injury, I would describe in my own words what I felt before I could realize I could no longer move my legs and arm, and perceived extreme pain in my body as I came out of morphine-induced coma. I was injured 25 years ago. Pain was with me, and pain has stayed with me, but I have learned how to cope with it on a daily situation. The pain is combined. It's musculoskeletal pain as well as neuropathic pain in most individuals. Beside underlying pathology phenomena, long hours of sitting, repetitive movements of the spared muscles and postural changes, along with other metabolic changes including obesity, has added to pain of grief to many of us. Pain impacts on physical levels, psychological levels, social functions, as well as many other dimensions of individuals' life, including health. For some, it's experienced as a worse outcome from the injury itself. No one understands how one can suffer from pain when one is paralyzed. In the process of making sense of life, when you have silent body, unable to move and describe to others about the symptoms of pain, which have almost no signs. It's a qualitative term, hard to measure or quantify. On the other hand, we all have something called grit. That's the courage, determination in difficult situations and circumstances for us to move on. On a personal note, I incurred my spinal cord injury 25 years ago. Below my neck permanently, I was injured for a while. My goals, my dreams were on a hold, but I had to move on. I was only 27 years old at that time. I had completed my medical school and I came to Canada when I incurred my spinal cord injury. In life, what I've seen today I will talk is how hope, pain, and grit intersect in our lives. First thing, when I got injured and came out of my rehab, which I left in 4 months, I hoped to accomplish when I left here much earlier than recommended in those days. It was almost a year, that was in 1993. I wanted to build an accessible home and able to drive so I can do things which were meaningful to me. And how did I visualize hope? The people who helped me in this photograph you will see was my family, my friends, my caregiver, who would get me help shower each day, eat healthy meals, and get strong so I could go out of my house and be able to be part of the community. Another pillar of my hope has been my husband. His visual and body language became a part of our everyday conversation. We didn't have to tell what I needed because I needed so many things, even like scratching my nose at times was hard, or scratching my neck. We laughed on little things, we traveled, we eased into new set of routine, which was then normal to us and is normal to us today. Then on 20th November 1999, how I visualized hope was having my son, which rekindled hope as it was time for joy, challenges of parenting. There was no time to think, but to just do it any manner you can. My footrest was common sitting place for my son, Kenny. I adapted few things around so I could take care of him. I could take him to others. It truly said, with all the help of others, as it says, it takes a village to raise a child. I raised him, and this year he's in university. What have we done at ONF, Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation? Our success is all in working together. I think that's what we heard today, the message is. So our intent here is, and should be, emphasis to diminish silos, facilitate collaboration, develop authentic partnerships across continuum of care and geographically in this province in Ontario as well nationally and internationally. Our pain agenda in ONF has been to develop, first of all, we developed first publication of Canadian best practices guideline for providing recommendation for screening, diagnosis, treatment, and models of care for neuropathic pain after spinal cord injury. We held a pain summit in 2016, brought all the stakeholders, patients, researchers, clinicians, the community, the policy makers to develop recommendations for pain research in this province. This year, few months ago, we had open calls for proposals in areas of pain, which had significant gaps, which was recommended at the summit. We have developed some platforms to develop this research and to implement it. So we have developed Ontario Spinal Cord Research Network, which supports 5 health academic centers from Ottawa, Kingston, Hamilton, Toronto, as well as London. We have developed Ontario Spinal Cord Injury Alliance, which is a platform to engage consumer in all the work what we do. So it's top-down and bottom-down approach which we undertake. Building partnerships provincially, nationally, internationally, as well as disseminations at meetings like today and other conferences. So what does the spinal cord injury community hope for? You are all at the forefront of clinical community when you see patients, especially neurosurgeons. Dr. Isai put you there. You see the patients, and when we first get injured, and you instill hope in them that they will be okay and they will be able to move in life. Life after spinal cord injury is worth living, but it has many challenges. Individuals must recognize the realities, opportunities, and hope. And we have to develop some strategies which you are leading here in Ottawa to decrease minimal neural loss, improve functions, as well as diminish pain. Our collective is the way we will lead forward. Here is the photograph of Man in Motions you might all have heard or not heard. It is Rick Hansen's, known as Man in Motion, who traveled across the continent after being injured at a young age of 16 years to bring awareness about life of people with difficulties, challenges they face each day, and their ability to still do what they wanted to do. He's considered as a Canadian celebrity. He has raised millions of dollars, and he's looking forward and came with a slogan, life without paralysis. And I think one day we will be there, with all of us being together in there. So in closing, I would say that love is better than anger. Hope is better than despair. Optimism is the way to go to live and accept all the challenges. So let us be loving, accepting, and optimistic, and let's assure hope one day that tomorrow will be better for those who live with pain, and we'll find best ways to manage it and live a productive life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara, for sharing your personal story. I think it certainly drives a sense of urgency for all of us researchers that study spinal cord, care after spinal cord, and repair of spinal cord. For those of us who are in the Ottawa community within the Brain and Mind Research Institute and across Ontario and across the nation. So once again, thank you very much for those great words. So this closes the more formal part of the night, but we have a question and answer panel section. So we've already started answering some questions, but certainly if anyone else has any questions you'd like to ask any of the panelists, you're more than welcome to do so at the moment. Yes, certainly. Yes, please.
So the question for Dr. Harris, I guess you're doing this research about the combination between THC and CBD and the combination of the two, and what is the best balance between what's going to give the most benefit to pain, and is it to be smoked, or is it to be eaten, or is it oils on the skin? Are you just in the middle, like there's no evidence come out yet, or is there any early things that indicate what the solution is?
So I don't think that anyone, you want me to use the mic? Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't think that anyone has come up with an answer. So in terms of clinical research, we actually don't have any data that's putting head to head any different chemical combinations. Now, so from survey data, from anecdotal, some people find pain relief just with THC. Some people find pain relief just with CBD. Now, there is evidence to suggest that, in fact, CBD takes the edge off of THC. So THC in some individuals it causes anxiety. And so some of the more intense effects of THC are thought to be moderated a bit by CBD. So I mean, as I said, I'm not a doctor, and there isn't clinical evidence to support one or the other, but I would say that we're in a very unique environment where in 2 days, someone who's experiencing pain could go out and try different products. And in that case, particularly if they're naive, smoking, generally the entire medical community will say no. Right, because we know of the problems related to smoking anything, regardless. So vaporization, as well as oils taken in capsules, and so this has a much different effect in terms of the time series of, it takes longer for something that's orally consumed to feel the effects than if it's smoked. So you'll feel the effects of smoking or inhaling cannabis a lot more quickly. And so then particularly, people who are more experienced with cannabis and recognize the feelings of THC, for example, that might be in fact something that they're seeking. And there was actually a very nice paper that Dr. Hildebrand brought to my attention, a recent review that was suggesting that maybe it suggested that cannabis is mainly affecting affect, so your attention and the way that you perceive pain rather than the physiology of pain signaling through the spinal cord. In which case, so evidence suggests that THC is the better one at attention and stuff like that.
Tara.
Is there any effect of neuronal loss on taking cannabis soon after injury in first 2 years? Is any effect of cannabis being studied in this area?
I'm glad you asked. This is something that we're actively looking at, and it has been looked at in the past. And there's kind of this yin and yang story in the literature where, in general, cannabinoids, THC and CBD, appear to be protective, neuroprotective. So against different types of insults in experimental models, cannabinoids protect. And in a small percentage, we see toxicity. Now, thanks to Dr. Sai, so one of the concerns that I had and some of the people that we're working with is people use cannabis to treat pain. But if you've had a spinal cord injury, you have underlying, you have inflammation, damage, and then you have to repair and regenerate. And there is also, we know that cannabinoids impact the way that neurons divide and replicate and then differentiate into, for example, a neural stem cell might become a neuron, or it could become a different cell type that supports neurons. And so this is something that we're actively looking at in human spinal progenitor cells. But again, what we don't see is we do not see widespread neurodegenerative consequences of chronic cannabis use. Now, that hasn't been studied in the context of an injured, a population that's experienced spinal cord trauma, for example. But there is lots of different types of data out there, but in general, we don't see a lot of brain atrophy following cannabis consumption.
So in your study, are you going to study how much dose will be effective dose of cannabis in this population?
So this is definitely, I would say that, because I come from I come from the complementary and alternative medicine world, where again, we have very poor clinical evidence of efficacy, but we have a large proportion of society that uses it and says that they're satisfied. So from my perspective, safety comes first. And so figure out what is the tolerability. And then, as I mentioned, some people experience pain relief at very small doses, and other people, it takes a lot more. There's differences between male and female. If someone is a heavy cannabis consumer, just like alcohol, it's going to take them a lot more cannabis to get the effects, just like an alcoholic has to drink more alcohol than someone who doesn't drink much. So, I mean, what's kind of, I don't know if I'd say it's nice, but people who are using cannabis right now have control. It's not available in metered, a capsule with a preset amount. You can try some and stop. There's a lot of feeling things out, and unfortunately, that's what happens when you put the market before the science, right? Everything is available. Well, everything was already available, so I shouldn't blame, everything was already available, and we just really need to figure it out. And I think that on an individual basis, trying to figure it out for yourself is probably going to be easier than us trying to figure it out at a populational level.
Hi. Tara used a really important word, which was hope. And when I saw Dr. Tsai's presentation, your statistics kind of crushed that hope. Speaking as a caregiver of somebody who's got a traumatic brain injury, what would you say is the horizon we're looking at in terms of real treatments that can be provided to people to make their lives improve, to potentially heal?
So it was never my intention to crush hope. And in fact, when I first started research, it was great going to conferences because there was really no research done on this. Patients with head injuries and spinal cord injuries are usually young, and all their finances go to supporting themselves. They really don't have money to then go and donate to research. And that's changed. People like Rick Hansen, Christopher Reeve, they brought awareness, but they also brought money. And with money came research and findings. And now when I go to conferences, I'm there all the time because there's so much more research going on. When I started, there was no clinical trials even on the horizon. Now there's clinical trials available. We have learned a lesson from the head injury ones, though. The pharmaceutical companies they expended billions of dollars in research, and when it came up zero, they were very gun shy in terms of trying to look at it again. And now we're, I think, a little bit more critical before going straight to clinical trials. Instead of going straight from an animal straight to humans, they're starting to be a little bit more critical. The research community in head injury has now looked at it as more than just, so for example, what they'll do is they'll say, oh, it's blue, right? Or the head injury, there's a head injury. But the reality is there's very different head injuries with different mechanisms and different causes. And when they were doing those trials, they just lumped them all together. So now they're starting to separate them and looking at specific types of injuries, locations of injuries, and then being more targeted with their therapy. It's kind of like cancer too. The trend now is, it's not just one cancer because there's different types of it. You can look at it specifically and target it towards patients. It's the same also with spinal cord injury. And spinal cord injury, I think, has learned from the brain injury people because what they're doing now is they're now starting to subclassify these clinical trials for, say, cervical injuries or thoracic injuries, looking at biomarkers or other things. So I think it's not that we're crushing hope. I think what we're doing is we're being more sophisticated in our ability to study these things so that we can actually have a higher likelihood of a positive result.
So over the years, there's been an emergence of synthetic cannabis, and I was just wondering, since I heard a lot of negative things about it, what's your take on that, and is there any place in the medical field?
Okay, so just to clarify, there's no synthetic cannabis. What it is synthetic cannabinoids. So these are drugs that might be structurally similar to THC, and in fact, there is one so THC that's produced in the plant is delta-9 tetrahydroxycannabinol, so there's a hydroxy group at the 9 position. There's a synthetic one that's not made by the plant, but that's made by chemists, that's delta-8. And so this, and then there's also many other synthetic that were built through more of a medicinal chemistry, and in general, kind of I don't want to, maybe I won't use this analogy, but they're more potent, right? So they are better at activating the endocannabinoid system than cannabis is. So the effects are a lot stronger. And they can also be selective, so THC as well as different molecules in cannabis activate both the central cannabinoid receptors in the brain as well as the peripheral ones and more in the immune system. Whereas a lot of the synthetic ones are targeted to really go to the brain. And so these drugs there were a couple on the market. One of them has been removed from the market. And they're also known as spice. So they're used recreationally as a street drug. So they have been approved there's a couple that have been approved clinically for specific uses. And in fact, if you were to go see, there's lots of different cannabinoid clinics or cannabis medical clinics where if patients who are interested in trying cannabis, they'll come in and they might be prescribed a synthetic cannabinoid first, particularly if they've never used cannabis and it seems like it's something that's, scary in one way or another. So, I mean, from what I've been told from doctors, is that, a lot of the side effects that are common to cannabis are more pronounced, but that it's simply a matter of monitoring the patients. I mean, you can still get a lot of the same therapeutic outcomes. But the nice thing about synthetic cannabinoids is if you buy a pill, it's that same compound in there at the same dose. Whereas in cannabis, you buy cannabis from one company and you buy it from another company, it might have different chemistry to it. Yeah.
We have time for one last question, if anyone has anything otherwise you're welcome to ask the panelists afterwards. Okay, so there's no more questions. I'd like to, first of all, thank the Brain and Mind Research Institute for inviting us as part of the Brain Health Awareness Week. There's still a lot of events going on this week. So tomorrow here at the Algonquin College is an event for neuromuscular disease and ALS, which is a disease affecting the spinal cord as well. So another relevant topic to what we've talked about today. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us and sharing their expertise. And thank you, Tara, for coming down from Toronto to speak with us, as well as thank you to the Bargavas for their continued support of our efforts here. And more importantly, thank you all for taking the time to come down and listen to what we have to tell you. And like I said, if anyone has questions they want to ask personally, then by all means you can come up. I'm sure the panelists are happy to stay a bit longer to talk to you one-on-one. So once again, thank you all very much and have a good night.
Thank you, Tuan. You finished it off already, almost. I just want to tell all of you, I really learned a lot, and it was a wonderful session. Thank you all for coming. I also want to acknowledge specifically the support of a number of people that made this happen within the Brain and Mind Institute: Natasha, Jennifer, Candice, Victoria, volunteers, and also Algonquin College for hosting us and for supporting us. Also, I think the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation has supported this event. I'm very grateful for that support. And at the end, because you raised the issue of hope and optimism, I wanted to just share one personal anecdote or experience with you, and that is when I trained as a neurologist in Boston, we rotated through a spinal cord injury hospital that was dedicated to spinal cord injury patients at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Boston. And I remember this was in the late 1990s that I was absolutely floored by the optimism and the creativity and the resilience of so many patients. And I would have never thought that it would be feasible to make fundamental progress within my lifetime for spinal cord injury. And then one day, a young PhD graduate came in to train with us at the Mass General and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and he was a medical doctor and did his PhD, and he was one of the first ones who, with his mentor, thought, how can we learn how the brain and the central nervous system speaks and communicates? To decode this, develop devices, which is now known as brain technology interface, so that we now see clinical trials, experimental trials at least, are going on in North America and elsewhere, where we can try to decode what the brain speaks and wants our arms and legs to do and how we should move to ultimately translate this by bypassing the spinal cord. We're not there yet, but we've made phenomenal progress toward this. So I don't know who said it, but somebody said the most complex thing that was ever been invented on this planet was the human nervous system. And so in many ways, we have to not only use the brain to assess what's the best possible care that we can deliver today, but our nature and deity up there has empowered us to think and dream and envision what could be a solution for problems tomorrow. And that is an enormous gift, and this goes for how to cure cancer and how to cure many other problems. So I'm inspired by the optimism of people with spinal cord injuries and chronic pain. And it's a lifelong lesson to just never give up and pursue those dreams. Martin Luther King said, if we can dream it, we can do it. So we're not there yet, but I think we'll get there. And people with that illness have been inspirational to all of us. So thank you for coming. And thank you, all of us, thanks to all of you and your team members for pushing the envelope further and further. And have a good evening. Thanks.